let me create an analogy for you. Let me paint a picture for you, okay? If you have a rule that says you're not allowed to murder someone, what the court is telling us here is that as long as you tell your victim that you're going to murder them, then the rules against murdering someone no longer apply to you, and you are free to murder them into perpetuity. You can murder as many people as you want, as long as you make it adequately clear to your victim that you're going to murder them. If that sounds insane to you, that's because it is. What's up, Internet nerds? Fun fact of the day. The rules for net neutrality aren't actually protecting us in the manner that we think they are. And in fact, the rules are voluntary. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're sitting there with that skeptical look on your face thinking, man, this guy doesn't know anything about what he's talking about. If you're one of those people, this video is more for you than it is for anybody else. So stick around because I think you're going to be surprised. Now, before we get into this, I want to make it very clear that this is not a video that is about encouraging you to support the regulations or to discourage you from that. I'm not going to give you propaganda. I'm not going to give you talking points. I'm not going to tell you what Google and Facebook say. I'm not going to tell you what Verizon and Comcast say. I'm not going to give you my own personal opinions. None of that. This is a neutral net neutrality video, okay? This is to go over the facts and the facts only. And the reason that I wanted to make this video is because there's a lot of misconceptions out there about what net neutrality is and what it isn't, and when the rules apply and when they don't. And I think that second part there is the most important thing, because everybody seems to have this impression that the net neutrality rules are this wide sweeping regulation that ISPs were made into utilities, and then regulations were put in place that all ISPs have to abide by. And quite frankly, that's not true. That's the furthest thing from the truth. And as we're going to find here in a moment, the rules are in fact voluntary, okay? The ISPs can choose to follow them or not. So there's always that. The first misconception that I wanted to talk about is this idea that if net neutrality goes away, that the ISPs are going to be able to do whatever they want. And quite frankly, like I said, the rules are voluntary and they can do that now if they wanted to. Okay, so I need to make that clear. And we need to recognize that there's this idea of net neutrality, the idea of keeping the internet free and open for everyone. And the mechanism by which we do that is then to restrict and prohibit ISPs from doing things. But what our idea of net neutrality is, it doesn't always line up with what the regulations end up saying, because you have to remember the government has to work within the confines of the Constitution. So there is huge First Amendment issues when it comes to net neutrality, which we're not going to go into in this video. I might make another video about it later. But what we're going to do now is we're just going to look at two things, We're going to look at the regulations themselves, and we're going to look at the United States Court of Appeals decision that goes over the regulations. And that's where we're going to spend most of our time, is on that decision. And I think it's important to go over these two things because I don't think most people have actually read them. So let's just dive in and take a look at them, shall we? The first thing that we're going to look at here is the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations. This is www.ecfr.gov. And you'll see here that we are on Title 47, Chapter 1, Subchapter A, Part 8. Title 47 deals with telecommunication. Part 8 deals with protecting and promoting the open internet. Okay, sounds good. And then, so we're going to come down here, and you can see this first term is broadband internet access service. Okay, sounds good. We're going to come down here, and then you see no blocking, no throttling, no paid prioritization. You see that broadband internet access service is mentioned in each and every one of those. So it would appear on its surface that the regulations are pretty clear. An ISP isn't allowed to block, throttle, or engage in paid prioritization. Like I said, there is a difference between our idea of net neutrality and what the government can actually do within the confines of the Constitution. And to understand that, what we need to do is go look at the court's opinion of the regulations. So Here we're looking at, as you can see, it's the United States Court of Appeals, filed May 1st, 2017, docket number 15-1063. This is United States Telecom Association v. Federal Communications Commission and the United States of America. Now, as you can see, the telecom lobby was suing the government here. So what were they suing them over? Well, a couple of things, but the first thing is something that we're all pretty familiar with. It was the argument that the FCC didn't have the authority to classify broadband internet as a Title II common carrier, okay? And the argument was that only Congress could do that because it would have fallen under the major rules changes, and only Congress can do that. And ultimately, we know how that went. The court said, no, that's not the case. The FCC has the legal authority to do this, and so they did it. So we're not going to delve into that because that's not really relevant to what we're talking about. So we're going to table that. The second thing that we're going to go over, or the second thing that's in here, deals with one particular broadband company by the name of Alamo Broadband Incorporated. They're a small broadband company out of Texas. According to this document, they have about 1,000 customers. And they are joined in their complaint with one person who goes, his last name was Berninger. And it was their argument that the net neutrality rules were a violation of the First Amendment. That the First Amendment protected them and allowed them to block content, to engage, to throttle service, and to engage in paid prioritization. Okay, and there was one justice on the panel that agreed with them. All of the other justices, however, were of the opposite opinion. They all came back and said, well, no, actually, the net neutrality rules do not raise an issue with the First Amendment. Okay, so you would think that it's pretty clear cut. Up to this point, we have regulations in place governing broadband internet access services, and the court has said that there's no First Amendment issue here. So you might be asking, why am I making this video? Well, it's in their explanation as to why there's no First Amendment issue that we're going to go over. And that is going to be where we're going to spend most of our time in this video, okay? And so I just wanted to give you that background there because that's where we're going to pick it up. We're going to pick it up right when they start explaining why there's no First Amendment issue. I'll give you a hint. It's because the rules are voluntary. So now I want to direct your attention to page 13, paragraph 2. And here it says, notwithstanding the arguments presented by Alamo and Berninger, and now also our dissenting colleague, the consensus view is correct. The net neutrality rule raises no issue under the First Amendment. It's exactly what I just told you. The key to understanding why lies in perceiving when a broadband provider falls within the rule's coverage. So immediately on the onset, they're telling us that our presumption here that the rules apply all the time are wrong. That there are times the rules apply and times when the rules don't. Okay? So hold on to your butts. It's about to get crazy in here. As the order explains, broadband ISPs that are subject to the rule sell retail customers the ability to go anywhere on the internet. They will transport and deliver traffic to and from all or substantially all internet endpoints. They display no intent to convey a message in their provision of internet access, as would be necessary to bring the First Amendment into play. Okay, still sounds pretty standard. When you think of an ISP like Comcast or Verizon, they're selling retail customers the ability to go anywhere on the internet, etc., etc., etc. Okay. But here's where it's going to start getting interesting. Now we're on page 14, paragraph 1. In particular, broadband providers subject to the rule represent that their services allow internet end users to access all or substantially all content on the internet without alteration, blocking, or editorial intervention. Customers, in turn, expect that they can obtain access to all content on the internet without the editorial intervention of their broadband provider. And in this next part, they're going to mention the panel and the agency. The panel is the judges, and the agency is the FCC. Okay? Keep that in mind for just 2 seconds. Therefore, as the panel decision held and the agency has confirmed, the net neutrality rule applies only to those broadband providers that hold themselves out as neutral, indiscriminate conduits to internet content of a subscriber's own choosing. We're going to continue on. Now we're on paragraph 2, page 14. For a broadband ISP that holds itself out to consumers as a neutral, indiscriminate conduit, i.e. as a pathway to all content on the internet, without alteration, blocking, or editorial intervention, the rule requires the ISP to abide by its representation and honor its customers' ensuing expectations. The ISP, therefore, cannot block its subscribers' access to certain websites based on its own preferences, nor can it engage in throttling, which, while stopping short of outright blocking, degrades a user's experience with selected content so as to render it largely, even if not technically, unusable. Nor can an ISP create fast lanes favoring content providers who pay the ISP or with whom it has a commercial affiliation, while relegating disfavored, i.e. non-paying providers to slow lanes. Like blocking and throttling, paid prioritization practices of that variety are incompatible with a promise to provide a neutral, indiscriminate pathway to content of a customer's own choosing. Now we're going to read the first sentence on the next paragraph that carries over to 15, and then we'll stop. The upshot of the FCC's order, therefore, is to fulfill the reasonable expectations of a customer who signs up for a broadband service that promises access to all of the lawful internet without editorial intervention. Remember that word, editorial intervention. We're going to see it a lot here in a moment. But let's unpack what they've just told us. What they've just told us is that the rules only apply to an ISP if it holds itself out to its customers as being neutral and indiscriminate. And that the reason for that is to fulfill the reasonable expectations of the customer who signs up for a broadband service that promises access to all of the lawful internet without editorial intervention. Okay, so what they're saying here is that if the ISP holds itself out as neutral and indiscriminate, what they are telling you is that you can go anywhere on the internet that you want to go. And it's at that point, and at that point only, that they're not allowed to block. Okay? So it sounds like net neutrality to me, up so far, but like I said, it's about to get really deep in here. So what we're going to do now is we are going to pick it up on page 15, paragraph 2. While the net neutrality rule applies to those ISPs that hold themselves out as neutral, indiscriminate conduits to internet content, the converse is also true. The rule does not apply to an ISP holding itself out as providing something other than a neutral, indiscriminate pathway, i.e., an ISP making sufficiently clear to potential customers that it provides a filtered service involving the ISP's exercise of, quote, editorial intervention. So, if your ISP, basically, if you go to an ISP and you say, hey, ISP, I want internet access, and they say, okay, we can provide you access to 150 websites. They are no longer holding themselves out as being neutral and indiscriminate conduits to the internet. And as a result, the rules no longer apply to them. Okay? I don't know about you, but that doesn't really sound like net neutrality we were sold. But we're going to continue reading, because it's going to get really clear really fast what they're saying here. For instance, Alamo Broadband, the lone broadband provider that raises a First Amendment challenge to the rule, posits the example of an ISP wishing to provide access solely to family-friendly websites. Okay, what they're talking about here, Alamo is positing this idea that, hey, what if we want to do just family-friendly content, right? That would require us to block all of the pornography, block all of the gambling, block all of the violence, If we find that Facebook and Twitter are not family friendly, that we would want to block those as well. And since we can't curate the content on Netflix and Hulu, we would block access to those as well, but we would stand up in its place our own video streaming service that we have editorial control over, so that way that we can guarantee that all of the content is family friendly. Basically everything that net neutrality is supposed to prevent. Okay? That's the example that Alamo is presenting here. Here's what the court has to say about that. Such an ISP, as long as it represents itself as engaging in editorial intervention of that kind, would fall outside the rule. Really? Really? How is that possible? ISPs were classified as a utility, the regulations were put in place, and all ISPs were supposed to follow them. But what the court is telling us here is that doesn't hold. They're telling us something different. We're going to go on and we're going to continue reading here. The order thus specifies that an ISP remains, quote, free to offer edited services without becoming subject to the rule's requirements. Again, that's not the net neutrality that any of us were sold. But let's continue reading, because it's going to get really clear really fast. That would be true of an ISP that offers subscribers a curated experience by blocking websites lying beyond a specified field of content, for example, family-friendly websites. It would also be true of an ISP that engages in other forms of editorial intervention. Notice they said other forms of editorial intervention, which means there's multiple forms of editorial intervention. They've already told us that blocking is a form of editorial intervention. So let's continue reading here. It would also be true of an ISP that engages in other forms of editorial intervention, such as throttling of certain applications chosen by the ISP, or filtering of content into fast and slow lanes based on the ISP's commercial interests. An ISP would need to make adequately clear its intention to provide, quote, edited services of that kind. So what they're telling us here is that if the ISP makes it sufficiently clear that they are going to block your service, they're allowed to do it. If they make it sufficiently clear to you that they are going to throttle your internet speeds, they're free to do it. If they tell you that they engage in paid prioritization and that they're going to create a fast lane for Netflix and a slow lane for Hulu, that they are free to do that, as long as they make it sufficiently clear to you, the customer. That's not the net neutrality that I think any of us were sold at all. It's not even close. So, how did we end up here? Okay, and if you're having trouble following along with what this says, because I know it's a lot of legal mumbo jumbo, if you're having trouble following this, let me create an analogy for you. Let me paint a picture for you, okay? If you have a rule that says you're not allowed to murder someone, what the court is telling us here is that as long as you tell your victim that you're going to murder them, then the rules against murdering someone no longer apply to you, and you are free to murder them into perpetuity. You can murder as many people as you want, as long as you make it adequately clear to your victim that you're going to murder them. If that sounds insane to you, that's because it is. So, like I said, how did we end up here? We ended up here, as we're going to find, this is how we ended up here. We need to go to page 17, first paragraph. And it reads, in the event that an ISP nonetheless were to choose to hold itself out to consumers as offering them an edited service rather than an indiscriminate internet access, despite the potential effect on its subscriber base, it could then bring itself outside the rule. Basically everything we just talked about. In that sense, the rule could be characterized as voluntary. but in much the same way that just about any regulation could be considered voluntary, insofar as a regulated entity could always transform its business to such an extent that it is no longer in the line of business covered by the regulation. So what they're telling us is that there's a loophole. That's what this is. This is a loophole. And there's lots of loopholes in society. I mean, it's not just tax loopholes or gun show loopholes, or in this case, internet loopholes. We also have other loopholes that are completely legal. For example, what they're talking about here is when you've got a regulation in place, you can always change your behavior to where the regulations no longer apply to you. Let me give you an example. In the United States, we have a tax on tobacco, okay? And if you were an individual that did not like paying that tax, you have a couple of options. You can either choose to not use tobacco, or you can choose to grow your own tobacco. And by doing either of those things, you no longer have to pay the tax on tobacco, okay? Because the rules for tobacco, and as far as taxation is concerned, is only when it's being bought or sold. If you're just growing your own out in your backyard, you're free to do whatever you want. You can use it on your own. You can share it with your neighbor. You can do whatever you want. As long as you're not buying and selling it, the rules for tobacco basically don't apply to you. So that's what they're talking about here. They're talking about the ISPs changing their behavior so that way that the rules no longer apply to them. But what we're finding here is that the court is actually saying that engaging in the very things that we don't want ISPs to do is what allows them to fall outside the rule. And one has to ask themselves, how did we end up with that? Because that's not the net neutrality that any of us were sold. Well, to understand that, you have to go back and look at the regulations themselves. And it begins right here. So here you see we have the term broadband internet access service. And here's what the definition says. A mass market retail service by wire or radio that provides the capability to transmit data to and receive data from all or substantially all internet endpoints. Okay. So here's how this would work. If you walked into Comcast right here today and said, hey, Comcast, I want internet access. And they said, great, we're a neutral, indiscriminate conduit to the internet. We don't have any restrictions on our content. You can go wherever you want, do whatever you want. We don't engage in paid prioritization, etc. As long as they do that, and as long as they represent themselves to you that way, then they fall in the definition of what a broadband internet access service is. And because they fit the definition of a broadband internet access service, then down here, all of the rules governing broadband internet access services would apply to them. If, however, you walked into Comcast and you said, hey, Comcast, I want to get internet access. And they said, great. And they presented you maybe with something like this. We have our first package, which is $39.99 a month, and we will allow you to go to 150 websites. Or for $44.99 a month, you can go to 200 websites. Or for $49.99 a month, you can go to 300 websites. When they present themselves to you like this, they are no longer providing you the capability to transmit data to and receive data from all or substantially all internet endpoints. In fact, what they're providing you is the capability to transmit data to and receive data from a very limited, a very small scope of websites. And because of that, they no longer fit the definition of a broadband internet access service. And because they no longer fit that definition, all of these rules down here below no longer apply to them. So that's how that works. So I don't know what else to tell you on this. I do find it interesting, though. And let me see if I can blow this up. I do find it interesting that this graphic right here is what's typically, tossed around on social media. And up here in parentheses, you can see it says, this is the internet without network neutrality. When in fact, as I just pointed out, it can look like that today, even with network neutrality or net neutrality, because I don't know. I just find it ironic that, and actually what I find even more ironic is you're more likely to see this with net neutrality than not, because the ISPs need to make it sufficiently clear. So I don't know how you feel about this. I don't know where that leaves us with this, but what you need to understand that the rules for net neutrality as they are written right now are nothing more than an enhanced transparency regulation, okay? They don't actually prevent the ISPs from doing any of the things that you think they do, okay? They're free to do whatever they want as long as they tell us about it. So there's that. The reason for that, and like I said, I'm not going to get into it in this video, but it's because of the First Amendment, okay? And it comes down to this idea, it comes down to the difference between the idea of net neutrality and what the government can actually do within the confines of the Constitution. And unfortunately, after reading the Open Internet Order, after looking at the regulations, and after reading that court opinion, I have come to the opinion that our idea of net neutrality, of keeping the internet free and open for everyone through government regulations, is not possible. It's not possible. You can't do it without violating the First Amendment. And that is why they ultimately, I believe, wrote the rules the way they did. They made it voluntary. So what they've done here is, you know, if you go into a store and you buy a product and it comes with a 10-year warranty, you know, if that product breaks in 3 years, you have a reasonable expectation that the company is going to fix that product. Okay, so basically what they're doing here is they wrote the rules in such a way that if the ISP promises you an indiscriminate conduit to the internet, that's what they have to give you, that they're not allowed to block your traffic, they're not allowed to filter your traffic, etc. But that's not the same thing as saying all ISPs are a utility and they are prohibited from engaging in these activities. Okay, that's two different things. So what we've gained out of this is companies are supposed to abide by their representations to us, and that if they are going to do things that we don't like, they have to tell us about it. So we're not really getting net neutrality in any form that we actually think we are. So that's my takeaway from all of this. I don't know what your guys' takeaways are. I think if you are somebody that is very much for the regulations, then your takeaway should probably be something very similar to mine. And also that even if you fight really, really, really hard and you get the FCC to not do that vote on December 14th, which is now 12 days away, if you convince them to not take the vote and leave the rules in place, you have to understand that the rules are voluntary, okay? That they aren't actually protecting you in any meaningful way, really. I mean, they are a little bit. You get some transparency out of it, but that's all. And that the regulations as they stand don't actually prevent ISPs from engaging in the behaviors that we don't want them to. So you have to understand that even if those rules stay in place, that they're not enough, okay? That your fight's not over. You got to ask for more. But like I said, it's going to be kind of hard to do more without stepping on the Constitution. And like, I'll get into that into another video because there is a huge First Amendment issue when it comes to net neutrality. So, and the other thing is, if you are more of a free market guy that you don't think the regulations are necessary, you need to understand that the free market has been at play for the last 2 years. Despite the fact that we've thought the government was the one controlling the internet, that's not the case. They've basically let the free market do what the free market does. The only thing that they've done here is said, hey, if you're going to sell something to a customer, you have to abide by your representation. And if you're going to engage in things that customers don't like, you have to be open and honest with them. So if you're a free market guy, just take away from this that, you know, that the free market has been reigning king for the last 2 years. They've just enforced a level of transparency and openness with the customer, which I don't think anybody can argue with. I don't think that's bad, but that's the net result of net neutrality. Okay. It doesn't amount to much more than transparency. So I don't know, folks. I don't know if you're unhappy about this. I don't know if you're angry. I don't know. Maybe you should be. Who knows? Because the one thing I will tell you is that we've been lied to for 2 years. I will say that because I was surprised when I read all those regulations or when I read the court's opinion of those regulations. So there's always that. I don't know. I don't really have much else for you guys. So subscribe to the YouTube channel if you want to see that second video. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you found it informative, definitely share it. Hit that thumbs up button, and I will see you guys again.